You may be seated.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir. In a nice loud voice, could you introduce yourself to the jury and spell your last name?
Sure. My name is Richard Atkinson, Atkinson.
And sir, what do you do for work?
I'm a medical examiner or forensic pathologist.
Okay. And what is, I'm just going to use the medical examiner term. What is a medical examiner, sir?
A medical examiner is a medical doctor who examines the bodies of people who are deceased to determine the cause and manner of their death.
Okay. And in order to become a medical examiner, sir, could you tell us about the training that was required in order to become a medical examiner?
Sure. I have a bachelor degree from Stony Brook University. I then did a 4-year MD at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. I then did a 3-year pathology residency at New York Presbyterian Hospital and Stony Brook Hospital in New York. And then I did a 1-year fellowship training in Boston at the office where I currently work, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. And that fellowship was specifically forensic pathology training.
All right. What is forensic pathology?
Forensic pathology is the branch of pathology that's involved with deaths that have a medico-legal, you're trying to find out the cause and manner of death in sometimes cases where that go to court.
Okay. And you used the term medical legal. Does that sort of distinguish forensic pathology from sort of the things that I don't know, I'll call them normal doctors, but doctors who are not medical examiners or forensic pathologists do?
Sure. Other pathologists that work in hospitals do autopsies on people, but it's generally people who have natural causes of death who died from diseases, whereas medical examiners examine the bodies of people who die in possibly suspicious circumstances from unnatural causes, injuries, poisonings, drug overdoses, that kind of thing.
So, in addition to the medical training that is necessary to become a doctor and become a pathologist, you also need to be familiar with the way certain objects, guns, knives, projectiles can damage the body, or other substances can cause harm to the body. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. And is that how do you get that sort of training, sir, for that part of your job?
That training is during the year of forensic pathology fellowship, and then I've also worked for 11 years now in addition to that as a medical examiner.
Okay. And do you continue to study those types of things over the course of those 11 years? Do you continue to study other cases by other medical examiners, other ways that death can be caused in your work?
Yes.
Now, I want to, I'm going to turn your attention to a specific autopsy that you performed on November 14th of 2022, an individual named Leroy Fowler. Are you familiar with that case, sir?
Yes.
Okay. And in connection with that case, you performed an autopsy?
I did.
And wrote a report?
Yes.
Ordered a number of tests to be done in connection with the autopsy?
Yes.
And then examine the results of those tests, informing your conclusions in this case?
Yes.
Did you also have access to Mr. Fowler's medical records?
Yes.
And did you review those?
I did.
Okay. And did you also have access to information about the circumstances that were known at the time regarding Mr. Fowler's death.
Yes.
And you take all of that, combine it with your training, your experience, and then your job is to determine, among other things, the cause of the death of Mr. Fowler, correct?
Correct.
All right. Now, I want to ask you a couple questions, sir. Are you familiar with a substance called ethylene glycol?
Yes.
What is ethylene glycol?
Ethylene glycol is a compound that's present in antifreeze, among other common items that you can buy at the store. It's a colorless liquid. You can't smell it, but it tastes, when it's by itself, it tastes sweet.
Okay. And is ethylene glycol something that you have familiarized yourself throughout the course of your career in order to do your job as a medical examiner?
Yes.
Okay. And have you studied cases of prior ethylene glycol poisonings prior to becoming involved in this particular case?
This is the only case I've ever personally had,
That
but
was a bad
yes.
question. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But as in forming your conclusions in this particular case, in doing your autopsy and in arriving at a cause of death, did you study for this particular case, in this particular autopsy, the way ethylene glycol can be used, can affect the body in order to reach the conclusions you're talking about today?
Yes.
Okay. Would that include the study of criminal cases that involved ethylene glycol poisoning?
I did look at some of those, yes.
Okay. Now, how does ethylene glycol get into a body?
All of the cases that I know of, ingested by mouth.
So it's you drink it. Someone drinks
Generally, yes.
it. Okay. And the fact that ethylene glycol, as you said, by itself is sweet, was that significant to you in the work you were doing in this particular case?
Objection, Judge. I think that's beyond the scope.
You know, I'm going to permit him to say yes or no. We'll see where that takes us. You may answer, Doctor.
I considered it, yes.
Okay. And why did you consider it, sir?
If it's sweet, it's easier to mix with another sweet drink that somebody might not notice that it's there.
All right. And with regard to tasting sweet things or other objects, does that vary among individuals? The ability to taste certain things, taste sweet things, taste bitter things?
Objection, Judge. I think that's beyond the scope as well.
Well, let me see you sidebar. I just want to make sure I understand the objection.
certain medical conditions affect people's ability to taste?
Yes.
Okay. What sort of medical conditions can affect a person's ability to taste substances that they're drinking or eating?
Judge, I would object again. It's a medical examiner who's testifying here.
I'm going to sustain the objection unless you lay a foundation for Dr. Atkinson's expertise in this particular area.
Okay. Is the ability to taste something that you studied in medical school and during the course of the rest of your medical training that you've had over the last 15, 20 years or so?
Yes.
Okay. And is that something that is generally taught at medical schools?
Yes, it's losing your taste is a symptom of many diseases. So of course we learn about that.
And what sorts of diseases or other things can cause a person to lose the ability to taste when they're drinking or eating?
Again, objection, Judge.
I will overrule it. I think a foundation has been laid. You may answer, Doctor.
Several things can. One thing that comes to mind is viruses, viral illnesses can cause either a transient loss of taste or smell or sometimes permanent.
Anything else?
Yes, several other things. I can't think of any right now.
All right, Doctor. I want to move over to the particular autopsy that you did in this particular case of Mr. Fowler. Right? Can you explain to the jury real quickly what do you do during an autopsy? What are the steps?
Sure. In an autopsy, we examine the external surface of the body first and photograph it to look for signs of injury or disease that could have caused the person's death. We then do an internal examination where we cut into the body, examine all the organs, also to look for those things. And then, importantly, we take samples of the body to either test for fluids from the body or tissues from the body to test for things like toxicology or microbiology. Sometimes we look at tissue under the microscope. All of these things to come to the diagnosis. And then we also often look at medical records because those can help as well.
All right. Now, in this particular case, had you looked at least some of the medical records or received some information from the hospitals where Mr. Fowler had been before starting your autopsy?
Yes.
Okay. So is that helpful for you for a particular reason? Do you want to know something about the history of the patient, not a patient, I guess, by the time they get to you, but the history of the person you're performing the autopsy on before you start?
Yes, any information is useful.
Okay. And so you performed the external examination of Mr. Fowler in this particular case?
Yes.
Anything that was important or relevant that you noted on the external examination?
The external examination was not particularly important. He had a scab on the top of his nose, some ecchymoses or bruises on one of his arms and both of his legs that I wasn't sure if they were bruises from trauma or from needles that he might have gotten during medical therapy.
None of the things that you noticed or just described for us that were on the external examination appeared to have anything to do with his cause of death. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay. So after the external examination, you move on to the internal examination. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. And what does that consist of, sir?
That consists of removing the organs, the major organs of the body, and examining them to look for signs of disease.
All right. Now, when you did that in this particular case, did you make any findings or notice anything on the internal examination of Mr. Fowler that was important to you in reaching your determination as to cause of death?
Yes.
Okay. Could you list for us, and then we'll go through them, what were the things that you noticed during the internal examination that were important to you in arriving at a determination as to cause of death?
Sure. His brain was very swollen. When you think of a brain, it has something called sulci, which are little grooves. If you've seen a brain, I'm sure you know what those are. When the brain swells, those become flattened, and so the surface of the brain is more flat. So that's the first thing I saw. Also, his brain stem, that's the portion that eventually becomes the spinal cord in your torso. The brain stem had hemorrhage in it, which you see when someone has a swelling of the brain that eventually kills them. He also had heart disease. His heart was enlarged. He had a bicuspid aortic valve. That just means a normal, it's one of the valves in the heart. A normal aortic valve has 3 cusps to it. People are sometimes born with aortic valves with only 2, and this is called a bicuspid aortic valve. It can cause issues with the heart. He also had atherosclerosis in his coronary arteries. That's just coronary artery disease, blockage of some of them. It wasn't super severe, but it was there. And then very slightly fatty liver disease. And finally, his kidneys were discolored and had a granular looking surface.
Okay. So let's start with the brain swelling. You said that the brain was swollen so that the folds in the brain were sort of flattened out.
Yes.
Okay. And why was that significant to you, sir?
That's a sign that the brain was swelling for some reason.
Okay. And sounds obvious when I say it, but brain swelling is not good.
Not good.
Okay. And in fact, brain swelling can cause death.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the brain stem hemorrhage, that's connected to the brain swelling?
Yes.
Okay. What does the brain stem hemorrhaging tell you?
It's what's called secondary brainstem hemorrhage, or also known as Durée hemorrhage.
Okay.
It occurs when the brain swells to the point where the cranial cavity in your skull doesn't expand its bone. But when the brain expands, it has to go somewhere. And there's a large hole in the bottom of the skull called the foramen magnum. That's just Latin for large hole. And that's where the brainstem normally goes through and becomes the spinal cord. When the brain swells, there's nowhere else for it to go but downward. So the brainstem, which is wedge-shaped, gets wedged into the foramen magnum and gets basically strangulated and dies. And that's why you see that hemorrhage.
Okay. So the brain swelling and the brainstem hemorrhage, were those directly related to his cause of death?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that there was he had an enlarged heart with the bicuspid valve.
Yes.
Okay. Did that have any effect on his cause of death?
In this case, I don't believe so, no.
Now, the coronary artery, the partial coronary artery blockage, you said that it was not, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you said not that severe, but it was there?
The most blocked that any of the 3 main coronary arteries were was 60%. You don't generally even have symptoms of coronary artery disease until 75%. So it was moderate occlusion of the coronary artery.
So not particularly a good thing, but not related to Mr. Fowler's cause of death?
Right.
The liver issues that you noted, what were those again?
Just mild hepatic steatosis, which is just fatty liver disease.
Did that have anything to do with his cause of death?
In this case, I don't believe it did.
Okay. And then you noted some injuries to the kidney, correct?
Yes.
And what were those injuries to the kidney, sir?
Well, it had a mildly granular surface. You can see that in hypertension, which is also why you have an enlarged heart. I believe he had hypertension. But more importantly, there was just a discoloration to the tissue of the kidney, which I wasn't, you can't tell what it is just from looking at the kidney, but I looked at it under the microscope.
Okay. All right. So when you looked at the kidney under the microscope to look at that discoloration, what did you find?
I found something called acute tubular necrosis. That's just when the tubules in the kidneys all die.
They die?
Yes. And also more importantly, or also important, the kidneys under a polarized light filter on the microscope showed numerous crystals.
What kind of crystals were they, sir?
These crystals were calcium oxalate crystals.
Okay. Sir, I'm gonna hand you 4 pieces of paper that contain 5 images. I'm just ask you to take a look at those, okay?
Sure.
Do you recognize those images?
Yes.
What do you recognize them to be, sir?
These are images that I took of the microscopic images of the kidney that I included in the autopsy report.
All right. And do these photographs depict the calcium oxalate crystals that you just mentioned to the jury?
Yes.
Your Honor, I offer these as the next, there's 4 page exhibits.
Any objection? No objection. They may come in. Thank you.
And doctor, which one of these images here is the one that best depicts the the calcium oxalate crystals that you just mentioned to us?
Different ones depict different things. This one kind of shows the extent of how many crystals there were.
All right, let me start with that one then.
Okay.
I'm going to just put this up.
Which number is that, Mr. Camilio?
This, thank you, Judge. This is 64. If we can get the autofocus to work. All right, there we go. And so the white, sort of the white, yellow, red-ish objects on the black background, the colored objects there, those are the crystals that you're talking about?
Yes, on this screen it just looks like black and white.
Yep.
The black is what it would look like with no crystals because the light is polarized to where you can't see any of the kidney, and the crystals are the white that you can see.
Okay.
So that's how many there were in this area of kidney.
And should there be any crystals in that area of the kidney?
No.
Oh, I leave the other side. Let the other side. What do some of those other photographs show that you can't see in this one, sir?
They show the kidney architecture because when you zoom in, even the polarized light allows you to see the kidney again.
Okay.
And it shows more crystals up close so you can see their shape better.
Okay. And the damage to the kidney that you just described for us, the acute tubular necrosis, is that visible in these types of images?
You would not be able to tell by looking at any of those.
All right, thank you. Now, calcium oxalate crystals in the kidney, is that so they're not supposed to be there, right?
Correct.
Okay, so that's concerning for you, something that you then look at in more detail in connection with the autopsy, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. What based on what you knew about Mr. Fowler's presentation at Anna Jaques Hospital, Mount Auburn Hospital, and Beth Israel, combined with the calcium oxalate crystals that you found in the kidney, what were you now investigating as his cause of death?
So if I had discovered these calcium oxalate crystals in the kidneys, not knowing anything else, that would immediately make me think this might be an ethylene glycol poisoning case. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
But I knew additional information before that, so I already knew to look for them.
Okay. What sort of additional information did you have, sir?
I knew from the medical records that the physicians at the hospital, where one of the hospitals where he was treated, had seen calcium oxalate crystals in his urine, and that he had many other findings, lab findings, and symptoms that all match up with ethylene glycol toxicity.
Right. And that would include the anion gap, an osmolar gap, and metabolic acidosis, among others?
Yes, among many other things,
okay.
Yes.
All right. So in order to sort of continue to explore, what you said was the first thing that popped in your mind is ethylene glycol poisoning. Did you send out for testing a blood sample that was taken at Anna Jaques Hospital a little bit after 9 a.m. on November 11th, 2022?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you request that be tested for?
Originally, it got sent to our state police lab here in Massachusetts to test for all the normal things that we screen every possible overdose patient for. So it got tested for many things there. And then I asked specifically for it to be sent to NMS to test for ethylene glycol.
Okay. So let's start with the original panel that was done by the Massachusetts State Police. Was there anything in that testing that you noted as part of your autopsy?
Yes.
Okay, what was that?
That was positive for something called benzoylecgonine, which is a metabolite of cocaine.
Okay. So there was some cocaine metabolites in Mr. Fowler's blood?
Yes.
All right. Anything else in that? This is essentially a toxicology test, is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. Anything else in that toxicology report that you noted or was important to you?
No.
Okay. There was no evidence of Percocet use by Mr. Fowler, is that fair to say?
Percocet is acetaminophen, Tylenol, mixed with oxycodone, and both of those were completely negative.
Now, with respect to the additional testing that was done at NMS labs, what was NMS testing for you?
I believe in this case they were only testing for ethylene glycol.
Okay. And you received the report back from NMS with their findings as to the presence of ethylene glycol in Mr. Fowler's blood, correct?
Yes.
Okay. What were the results of the testing?
It was present in this sample. The concentration was 52 nanograms per milligrams
Milligrams
per deciliter.
All right.
Sorry. Nanograms per deciliter.
All right. Once you got that result back, and then in connection with the tubular necrosis that you described for us, the calcium oxalate crystals in the kidney, the brain swelling and brain stem hemorrhage, and then in conjunction with all of the information that you had from Mr. Fowler's medical records, were you able to determine his cause of death to a reasonable degree of professional certainty?
Yes.
And what was your conclusion, sir?
That it was ethylene glycol poisoning.
Okay. So how does ethylene glycol kill somebody?
Sure. Let me just correct. Since I said nanograms per deciliter, it was milligrams per deciliter.
Okay.
Just for the record.
All right, thank you.
How ethylene glycol kills someone, it's a rather prolonged process. After ingestion, It usually takes a few minutes, sometimes up to 30 minutes, to show any symptoms, but there are generally 3 groups of symptoms that you see at different times. The first group generally happens in the first 12 hours, and you see mainly neurologic symptoms, so it acts a lot like ethanol intoxication. Ethanol is just the alcohol that people drink at bars. So you exhibit similar behaviors, loss of coordination, slurring of speech, confusion. Depending on the amount, you can also have vomiting, abdominal pain. You can even die during this period and have seizures. Then usually after 12 hours post-ingestion, you start having more cardiovascular symptoms, and those include high blood pressure, fast heartbeat. You can have what's called Kussmaul respirations. That's just breathing very quickly and very deeply. And you do that because what you also have during this period, even sometimes earlier, is metabolic acidosis. That's when your blood becomes more acidic than it should be. And your body wants to correct that by breathing deeply and quickly. So that's why you have those breathing changes. You can also, during this time, die from cardiac arrhythmias or from congestive heart failure. And then the later period, usually after a day or 2, you can have renal failure, kidney failure. And the reason this happens is, I should back up and say, ethylene glycol itself is not necessarily toxic when it's in your bloodstream. It gets changed by an enzyme in the liver into first glycolic acid, which is what causes the metabolic acidosis. And that is toxic to many different organs. And then the glycolic acid can or is eventually changed to oxalic acid. Oxalic acid is what damages the kidneys. It combines with the calcium that's normally in your bloodstream into the calcium oxalate crystals that we just saw. So this decreases the amount of calcium in your bloodstream, which causes your muscles to have spasms. So during this portion, you can also have muscle jerking and spasms, almost like seizures, but not of your brain. But those crystals that we saw in the kidneys are what kills the kidney cells. It blocks some of the tubules, it damages them. The acid itself might also damage the cells. So that is the final thing, is the renal failure.
And that the renal failure is the renal failure, the calcium oxalate crystals, the tubular necrosis, that would be essentially stage 3 of the 3 phases that you just talked to us about?
Yes, and you can die during any of these phases. Generally, you die from multi-organ failure, but these are the organs that are affected during those certain times.
All right. Now, which of the, I'm going to use the term stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. I know that they overlap, and I know that they're not, sometimes just discrete as we're trying to make them sound here. But what stage 1 symptoms did Mr. Fowler show that you were aware of?
Action, Judge.
Overruled. He may have it based on his review, and you've considered all the medical records from the 3 hospitals you indicated. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, you may answer.
Even as early as the EMS report, who arrived to his house, mentioned that he was that he was confused, that he was not exhibiting good coordination. In the first ER, Anna Jaques, he had dry mucous membranes, which shows dehydration, which is one of the other things that I didn't mention. He had altered mental status, which you would expect. He had abdominal pain, I believe nausea, though I'm not totally sure.
Nausea being some sort of vomiting.
Or he was just wincing when they pushed on his abdomen. He seemed dizzy, drunk, like symptoms.
Okay. And slurred speech or inability to speak, could that be a stage 1 symptom as well?
Yes.
All right. Now, into the stage 2 symptoms, which of the stage 2 symptoms that you just described for us did Mr. Fowler show?
I believe in the first hospitalization, the first day that he was at Anna Jaques, he also had the fast, deep breathing that we described.
That's the Kussmaul breathing that you just described?
Yes. And that was the hospital where they first saw metabolic acidosis.
Muscle spasms were present, is that fair?
Either that hospital or the next one, they described jerking movements.
Okay.
I think the second hospital.
Second hospital?
Mount
So that
Auburn.
would have been Mount Auburn?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the stage 3 symptoms that you described for us, which ones of those did Mr. Fowler display?
If you're talking about the renal failure symptoms, it's kind of complicated because he showed signs of early renal failure at the first hospital. And then I believe before he even went to the final hospital, his metabolic acidosis had cleared up, but was still showing signs of kidney failure.
Okay.
So he probably had kidney failure or some amount of kidney failure at all 3 hospitals.
All right. Now, you mentioned so sometimes, as you said, some of those symptoms, they get put in the stage 3, but in Mr. Fowler's case, they might have actually showed up in stage 1 or stage 2. So it's not sort of one stage doesn't end and the next stage doesn't immediately begin. There's overlap and it depends on the course of everybody's different progress with the disease or with the illness.
It also depends on how many ingestions there were, what times those were. So
Multiple ingestions can change the timeline of symptoms.
yes.
Is that because ethylene glycol would then be hitting the bloodstream and hitting the organs at different points throughout that timeline?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned, sir, multi-organ failure. What is multi-organ failure?
So that just means there's more than one organ involved in the death. And technically, probably most deaths are multi-organ failure
I'm sorry, go ahead.
at some point. But we use the term when they're hospitalized, still alive, but you can see multiple organs failing.
Did Mr. Fowler show those signs of multiple organ failure?
Yes.
Which organs of Mr. Fowler's were failing or had failed during the course of his hospitalization?
Well, his kidneys showed signs of failing early on. At the final hospitalization at Beth Israel, he lost pupillary reaction. That's when they shine a light in your eye. The pupils are supposed to get smaller. When they don't, that's a sign of brain damage. So his brain failed at the final hospital.
Okay. And was that, obviously, when your brain fails, is that ultimately what killed Mr. Fowler?
He was on a ventilator, so once you have brain death, the doctors do brain death testing to show that you have no chance of recovering, and then your body is still being kept alive by the ventilator and by your heart if it's still beating. But once you remove that, then that is when your body also dies.
And so all of those symptoms that you just described for us were the result of the ethylene glycol poisoning and the body metabolizing that ethylene glycol into the other various substances that you mentioned for us?
Yes.
Okay. With respect to that metabolization, at some point during after exposure to ethylene glycol, the body essentially metabolizes all of the ethylene glycol, and now you're only left with these byproducts. Is that fair?
It can, depending on whether your kidneys are still functioning. You can metabolize it all. In this case, he also was treated with something called fomepizole and also with hemodialysis, which is where you filter the blood outside of the body when your kidneys are not working. So that probably would have removed a lot of the ethylene glycol if there was any left.
Now, just finally, doctor, did the cocaine that was in his system appear to have any effect on his cause of death?
No, the mechanisms by which cocaine does cause death were not present here.
Okay. So, your opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that what killed Mr. Fowler is ethylene glycol poisoning, is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Nothing further, Judge.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Norkunis.
Thank you. Cocaine injection, doctor. Cocaine use by itself accelerates the heart rate, right?
Yes.
And this gentleman had heart problems, right?
He did have heart problems.
You indicated he had some sort of blockage in his arteries as well, correct?
Yes.
So cocaine use was a substantial risk to him with all those comorbidities already within, right?
Yes.
Now, you began the presentation by indicating that, question from Senior, that you've had one case, correct, previous to this, dealing with ethylene glycol? Or was it the only case?
This is the only case.
Okay. And then you decided, you chose to go out and do some reading about ethylene glycol, correct?
Yes, but also I had read about it before this.
Okay. And were you also aware of a statute dealing with ethylene glycol in Massachusetts?
The one about putting bittering agent into it? Yes.
So Massachusetts legislature, in their wisdom, we assume researched the matter, and because of improper use of ethylene glycol, put a product into it in motor vehicle products in Massachusetts, correct?
Correct.
And the legislature determined that the Beatrix was one of the most bitter substances known to mankind, right?
Yes, that's denatonium.
It's big name, right?
Right.
I can't pronounce, but it's
Benzoate.
It's known as Beatrix, correct?
Right. I think that's its brand name.
Now, when you, just as a side, when you sent the blood out to NMS, was there any interest in finding out whether there was Beatrix within it?
I think when I sent it,
Right.
no. I discussed it with the detective later.
All right, so the Trooper Williams,
Yes, I think it was him.
whether you should test for Beatrix?
We discussed, he asked a question about whether I knew if you could test for it.
And at that point in time, it would be fair to say you had never had the need to do it, so you didn't know whether they could or they couldn't, right?
Well, the medical examiner is mainly in charge of determining the cause of death. So I believe I told him that we can't do it, but maybe some lab somewhere might, and I don't know.
Okay. Now, there was some brief discussion with you about tasting or whatever else, right? Whether a person could taste something. Your field of medicine is dealing with people that are dead, right?
Correct.
You can't determine whether they can taste or they can't taste, right?
From doing an autopsy? No.
Now, in this particular case, when you did the external exam, you indicated you didn't find anything of substance indicating there were head injuries, body injuries, external body injuries that you could determine, correct?
Nothing that would have contributed to his death, no.
But nothing that would have needed or required immediate medical attention. Would that also be fair to say?
No signs of anything that would, no.
Now, in relation to this particular case, you had talked about the calcium oxalate crystals, correct?
Yes.
And other causes of forming those types of crystals can be a high sugar intake, right?
I'm not totally sure that that could cause that, but there are other things that can
People
cause
with diabetes sometimes have a higher number of calcium oxalate crystals. Are you aware of that? Or do you have any knowledge about that?
I know that you can have oxalosis or oxaluria from other things, yes.
Which would create the crystals in the kidneys, right?
Yes.
Now, is it fair to say that any of the people that the bodies that you look at, you don't open the kidneys unless there was a problem that you believed attributable to the death from the kidneys?
Any case that we autopsy, we look at the kidneys.
You look at everything,
Yes.
pull it all out, okay? And many times you find oxalate crystals within the kidneys, correct?
I've never seen them before this case in the kidneys.
Now, in this particular case, you had discussed with Mr. Filio what's generally recognized as the 3 stages of someone who has ingested ethylene glycol, correct?
Yes.
And the first stage is generally something you would equate to being, you would look at the person and say they might be intoxicated from liquor, right? Ethanol itself, right?
Sure.
And the timeline for that can be 30 minutes, right? To 12 hours, right?
Right.
That means there's a variant that's undeterminable in advance or even afterwards, depending upon the individual person, right?
Yes.
And in this particular case, did you become aware that Mr. Fowler, the deceased, was texting up until 5:30 in the morning on an iPhone with a consistent message and using and having the dexterity to manipulate that phone and use it all the way up through 5:30? Did you become aware of that?
I don't think I knew that, no.
And that would be something that most people who are inebriated and losing their dexterity and their physical abilities won't have fingers on a small screen that will be able to type a consistent message, right?
Depending on the severity,
The level of intoxication, right?
that could be true, yeah.
And at 7, assuming for me, at 7 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Fowler is sufficiently impaired that he can't stand up. That would show at some point in time that the first stage had come on within half an hour of that time frame, right? Maybe?
No, I don't.
If the stages are correct, right?
I don't know
You don't know
at
exactly
what
with him when it was
exact
on.
hour you would lose the ability to text.
Now, you get to look at his personal medical records, right?
Yes.
And then you get to look at the hospital records,
Yes.
and they said that he had polysubstance abuse, right?
Yes.
And generally, is it accepted in the literature that you have looked at and looking at ethylene toxalate that if you've talked about the medication and dialysis can assist the person, right?
Yes.
And if the person is receiving treatment, did you learn, within the first 4 hours, particularly the medication, that they can be saved?
The earlier you receive that the medication and dialysis, the better chance you have, yes.
And for those people that might not have the medications, you could also give them liquor, right, to change the ethanol to methanol, right, within the body?
I believe before the 1980s, that was the original antidote.
And it would still work to some degree, correct?
It works nearly just as well, I think, as fomepizole.
Now, in looking at the records from Anna Jaques Hospital, he was taken there and arrived there at 9 o'clock in the morning, right? Approximately.
Yes, I think like a minute or two before that.
I can show you that, but I'll suggest that too.
Right.
Right. And he doesn't get to Mount Auburn until 9 o'clock at night.
Yes, later that evening.
And Anna Jaques is unable to recognize what his need for treatment is. It's fair to say from the records, correct?
They were ruling out a lot of causes, and I think they had a pretty good idea by the end.
But did nothing for it, correct?
They did a lot of things. They intubated him. They
never did
started the diagnosis.
No, they didn't have that diagnosis, right, of ethylene
But they
glycol poisoning.
did not do fomepizole and hemodialysis until the second hospital.
It was either one of those, right?
Right.
They didn't give him liquor off the shelf. So in essence, in terms of what his final resolution was, they didn't treat it, correct?
No.
And so by the time he left there, more than 12 hours likely had passed from any ingestion, correct?
Yes.
And at that point in time, then, he perhaps had already gone beyond stage 2, correct?
Yes, possibly he was at stage 2 already in the first hospital.
Now, and then they used dialysis upon him. You've indicated that to take out his the ethylene glycol that he has in his system. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, when you looked at the medical records, was that also inclusive of looking at the records from Beth Israel Hospital?
Yes.
And did you look at the record from on the 13th of November at 6:42 a.m. by Dr. Sin, S-Y-N-N?
I looked at all of them at some point.
Okay. And were you aware of the team that he had looking at him? And his determination was that the history from Mount Auburn could be consistent with ethylene glycol ingestion. However, the story is a bit unusual.
Yes.
Remember reading that?
Yes.
And this again was the team from Beth Israel, correct?
Correct.
They had spent more than 65 minutes with him as they set out in their report, correct?
Yes.
Theoretically, and they say at that point in time, there was also no clear history of any ingestions in this particular case. And his levels are normal with them. And they were unclear as to whether it was actually ethylene glycol, correct, at that time?
I'm not. Yeah, let me see it.
May I approach it?
Yes, you may.
Time is up here.
Yeah, so no clear history of ingestion just means that nobody told them that there was any ingestion. When they say that it's a bit unusual, they're talking about the fact that the osmolar gap was not high at the first hospital, which,
Anna Jaques, correct?
right, which normally the osmolar gap is high at the beginning and gets smaller.
Let
And
me pause for a moment. That
Right.
would be in the first 12 to 15 hours, correct? So he didn't have that
Right.
within the first 12 to 15 hours.
it's,
And that therefore makes it somewhat of an unusual situation, right?
I do think there was a osmolar gap at the second hospital, but yes, it's not exactly the 3 stages, which I already said don't always follow that exact timeline.
Now, at some point in time in the Beth Israel record, did they believe that he died of a stroke?
If by stroke you mean brain swelling with brainstem death, then yes, the stroke team was called because of his pupillary non-reaction. The stroke team gets called to come and see what's wrong. And I think at the prior hospital, Mount Auburn, they had already done head imaging that showed swelling brain. So I think they knew that that was already occurring, and that's why they transferred him, so that he could have electroencephalogram monitoring at the other hospital, at Beth Israel.
So at Mount Auburn, he gets dialysis, right?
Yes.
And he also gets that, I believe that medication that you mentioned, I think that was also used for him.
Yes, fomepizole.
Would you just spell that? I've heard it many times, and I don't know if it begins with an F or a H. I can't quite
It's
hear it.
F. I hope I know how to spell it. FOMEPIZOLE.
That's close enough. I now
hope.
have a sense of what you're saying. That's all I wanted.
Now, when you sent out the blood sample to NMS and they came back with 52 milligrams per deciliter, that equals about 26 grams. Would that be the equivalent when you're chasing in the metric system into grams?
Grams is the metric system. So milligram just means 1,000th of a gram. So no, it would be 0.052 grams. Per deciliter.
Per deciliter.
Right.
May I have a moment, Judge?
Yes, you may.
It's fair to say you did not make any attempt to try and do a timeline based upon the stages of ethylene glycol poisoning as to when Mr. Fowler might have consumed any ethylene glycol.
I don't think you can be very accurate just based on the lab values and hospital records. The fact that he was already exhibiting renal failure may argue that it was many hours earlier, but I can't be sure.
And would be also a fair statement that his comorbidities as to any effect upon either acceleration or not acceleration of ethylene glycol was not something you made a determination.
His comorbid.
Is undergoing,
Right.
Right.
It's hard to determine if someone has a very, very bad heart whether they may have survived. In this case, I don't think so. But in a case where the poisoning was maybe could have been saved if they hadn't had heart disease, then I sometimes consider that. But in this case, I think he had so much that his kidneys would have failed no matter what, and his brain was swelling either from the toxic effect of the acids themselves or from lack of oxygen.
And it's likely by the time he left Anna Jaques Hospital, there was nothing any further medical care could do to save him, right?
I'm not totally sure about that.
Whatsoever. And the ethylene glycol was metabolizing and moving at whatever speed it moves through the body, right? And he's thoroughly into stage 2 at that point in time, right?
Given the fact that he got the known treatment at Mount Auburn Hospital, the second hospital,
For the timeline.
and then still died, it's possible that he was on that trajectory after he left Anna Jaques, and nobody could have saved him.
Thank you. Nothing further, Judge.
Mr. Camellia?
So just fair to say that getting him to the hospital sooner would have improved his chance of surviving.
Yes, the sooner after ingestion, the better.
The longer you delay, the longer someone delays, for instance, in calling 911, the more likely that the person is to die from ethylene glycol poisoning.
Yes, also the diagnostic process sometimes takes a long time. So if you have no idea what's causing something, it's harder to know that you need to treat it this certain way.
Thank you. Nothing further, Judge.
But that's still within the first, say, 4 hours, right? If you get to them within the first 4 hours, you can treat them somehow, even if they had to give them liquor at Anna Jaques Hospital, right? If they recognize what the issues were.
The sooner the better. So I'm not sure there's a certain number of hours where it matters.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you very much, Doctor. You may step down.
Your Honor, as we discussed yesterday, I have a couple of things that I'm going to read.